At the moment she was pushed onto the American landing craft, she instinctively straightened her back. Not for the sake of dignity, but because she was used to disguising fear as obedience. In the span of just 7 seconds, her gaze went through a subtle shift from stiffness to fanatic intensity. She looked as if she were waiting for an order, yet she knew no one would ever command her again. She looked as if she were guarding her loyalty, yet she no longer understood to whom that loyalty should be given. In those 7 seconds, Tanaka Ruri, a shadow at the very bottom of the Japanese army, realized for the first time that no matter how straight she stood, no one would see her as a soldier anymore. Loyalty suddenly failed in that dawn, and she had nothing with which to replace it. It was the spring of 1945, the final phase of the Pacific War. Seawater slapped against the landing craft's hull, mixed with the post-battle smell of diesel and floating wood fragments. The column of captured prisoners to which Ruri belonged was lined up in the center of the deck. American soldiers ordered them to sit down and not move. She remained frozen in place until a young American gently tapped her shoulder, not with rough shoving, but with a reminder so polite it was almost indifferent. She tensed at once, as if her whole body were wrapped in air that had just been torn open by an explosion, her breathing rapid and shallow. She remembered that in the past, a hesitation of half a second would bring shouting, her hair being yanked, or an invisible useless written across her face. So she hurried to sit down, lower her head, and place her hands neatly on her knees, her posture that of someone waiting to be scolded. But no one scolded her. No one even looked at her. The sudden absence of orders frightened her more than capture itself. The crossing was almost entirely silent. The sea was wet and cold, the sky grey, and from time to time seabirds skimmed past the deck. The wind lifted the ends of Ruri's hair. She did not dare to reach up or raise her head. She felt the world was stripping away her identity little by little, not through humiliation, but through a blankness more unfamiliar than humiliation. She had been taught all her life that defeat was shame and capture was death, yet here she was, neither dead nor openly shamed, only trapped in a confusion she could not explain. For the first time, she did not know what being alive meant. On the morning they reached the coast of California, the fog was thick and the harbor lights wavered faintly in the damp air. Ruri was led down from the transport ship with the line of prisoners. The instant her foot touched the cold, wet concrete of American soil, her heart gave a violent jolt, as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. She almost wanted to kneel and prove in some way that she was still loyal, but she no longer knew to whom she should prove it. Her old unit was receding ever farther behind her, and in this new world there was no one waiting to claim her loyalty. For the first time, she discovered she no longer had any role she knew how to play. The POW camp lay not far away. Beyond the barbed wire stood a row of utilitarian wooden buildings with brown walls and sloped roofs, like a temporary town whose order had become overly stable. The air carried no smell of gunpowder and no shouting, only the low murmur of administrators talking, the rustle of paper and the faint hum of light bulbs. Ruri walked with the column as if she were stepping into another world. She instinctively observed everything, the placement of waste bins, the rhythm of the guards' steps, whether the wooden walkways needed sweeping, whether fallen leaves blown by the wind should be cleared away in advance. All the instincts that once allowed her to appear useful had nowhere to go here. She was taken into a registration room. A temperature record card was placed in front of her. On it were printed her prisoner number, the time for daily measurements, and medical fields to be filled in. The American Army doctor moved quickly and without emotion as he handed her the card. "Keep it," he said in simple English, with no explanation and no attempt to make sure she understood. Her hand trembled slightly as she received it. This kind of order, free of anger, expectations, and threats, left her at a loss. In Japanese camps, every order bared its teeth. Here, orders felt as light as a sheet of paper. She was then assigned to a small open square under a sunshade where several wooden benches had been set out. The benches were rough and much used, yet softer than any floor she had ever slept on in the old barracks. Ruri did not dare sit. She stood beside a bench as if guarding some ceremony that would never begin, waiting for someone to say, "Sit. Stand straight. Go clean." But nothing happened. The American guards merely watched from a distance, their posture supervisory but non-intrusive. A world without commands unsettled her more than the barbed wire did. When she finally sat down, her back was still rigidly straight and her hands lay flat on her knees, motionless. The wind lifted the small cotton spool she carried, an item she had brought all the way from her old camp, believing it could still be of use, for mending, tying, securing, serving. Yet here it felt like a fragment from a previous life that no longer belonged. Her fingertips moved slowly over the outer layer of the cotton spool and her fingers trembled. It was not softness she felt, but proof that her old identity had been refused. The first real shock did not come from the Americans. It came from the group she knew best. Several Japanese prisoners stopped by the benches. Their uniforms were just as worn as hers, their eyes just as exhausted and weary. Ruri almost sighed with relief when she saw them, thinking she had finally found a trace of her former belonging on this new shore. A moment later, that hope was cut off. "Don't sweep here," one of them said coldly, as if his gaze were turning away from something unclean. "No one needs that." Ruri froze. Only then did she realize she had unconsciously begun gathering the fallen leaves near her feet. It was the most familiar action of her life, the one she believed could make others think she was useful. The soldier added in a tone light as a blade cutting through paper, "You've done enough of that before, haven't you? We don't need it." It was not an insult, yet harsher than one. For the first time, she understood that her old identity was not only useless, but also wearisome to others. She lowered her head. Her fingers, unsure what to do, coiled and uncoiled the cotton spool. A shame, sharper than humiliation, rose from her chest, not because others looked down on her, but because she suddenly knew. What she had always called loyalty was, in everyone else's eyes, nothing more than the lowest form of forced labor. The wind that day was mild, yet it felt as though it could blow her off balance with a touch. She sat on the bench, her feet dangling, with no idea how she was supposed to go on living. At 6 o'clock sharp, the camp woke to the sound of a whistle. Light leaked through the gaps in the wooden walls, picking out dust in the air. Tanaka Ruri sat up before the others, her back still held in the stiffness drilled into her in the old barracks. She put the cotton spool in her pocket as if fixing a fragment of another era to her body. The false alarm of the previous night had left no bruises, only a silence that was harder to describe. Roll call took place as usual. American personnel checked each prisoner's number one by one, their tone brief and clear. Ruri flinched slightly when she heard her own number, not from nervousness, but because this kind of undifferentiated acknowledgement felt strange to her. In the old army, roll call was both inspection and intimidation. Here, it was nothing but procedure. Procedure, in fact, was what she found hardest to adapt to. There was no scolding, no sudden extra tasks, no orders that changed with a superior's mood. There were only forms, record cards, scheduled walks and meals, a whole day defined by a mechanical and predictable structure. For the first time, she realized that in this place she did not need to demonstrate loyalty or prove her worth through effort, and that, paradoxically, made her movements more constrained, like someone who is always bracing to catch a burden that might fall from above. The morning air was dry, the camp's dirt paths worn fine by repeated footsteps. She was assigned to the routine health check. Medical staff called them up by number and told them to remove their shoes, take their temperature, and stand still while data were recorded. Gradually, neat rows of numbers filled her record card, data belonging to herself in a form she had never encountered before. In the old army, she had no such file. Her existence was swallowed up in some vague collective. But here, every line of figures corresponded precisely to her own body. Facing herself so directly made her uneasy. After the checkup, the prisoners were allowed to spend some free time under the sunshade. It was the quietest period of the day. Some sat on the benches with eyes closed, some read repatriation forms, others conversed in low voices. Ruri did not join any group. She sat at the end of a bench, leaving a polite yet awkward distance between herself and the others. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the canopy, falling on her sleeve and revealing the outline of the cotton spool in her pocket. She did not unwind the cotton, nor did she tuck it away carefully. She simply let it sit there in silence. At 10 o'clock sharp, the loudspeaker crackled to life. After a faint hiss of static came a calm female voice in English. Ruri could not understand the words, but she could distinguish a tone that had nothing to do with orders. It reported the weather, civilian news, traffic conditions in some distant city, information slow and steady, unrelated to the battlefield and unconnected to authority. It was the first time she had heard a voice that was not meant to control anyone. She raised her head and let her gaze follow the direction of the loudspeaker. For the first time in her life, she sat still and listened to a world that was not organized around her, that did not demand a response from her, that did not even particularly care whether she existed. Time moved forward in this quiet. Lunch, cleaning, a short walk, another broadcast. She remained silent, but her body slowly loosened. Her breathing grew deeper, and her shoulders gradually dropped away from her ears. No one was giving her orders, yet for the first time she could sit quietly through an entire hour without waiting for one. Change began in these tiny gaps, so small as to be almost invisible. The evening wind was cooler. On her way back to the barracks, Ruri passed the camp's small library, a simple wooden hut set aside for donated magazines, atlases, old newspapers and light novels. The door was half open. A few Japanese prisoners sat inside, leafing through books. She halted in the doorway for a few seconds, uncertain whether she should enter. The old army had taught her to retreat to the edge of any space, and the open, egalitarian layout of this room left her unsure how to stand alongside others. In the end, she stayed outside, merely looking at the shelves. She could not read the titles, but she recognized the paper's texture and the outlines of photographs and maps. They belonged to another color palette entirely. Quiet, ordinary, real. They had nothing to do with her, yet they did not exclude her. That night she placed her temperature record card beside her pillow. The paper had curled slightly at the corners. She smoothed it with her fingers. The numbers were simple, but closer to herself than any honorific or rank had ever been. The camp lights dimmed. Outside the fence, the wind moved evenly through the dark. When she closed her eyes, her chest no longer held yesterday's panicked collapse. Instead, there was a blank space, strange, but not frightening. She dimly understood that this blankness was not a threat, but a patch of ground no one had yet named. And for the first time in her life, that ground belonged to her. The library was inconspicuous within the camp. Just two wooden huts joined together, bearing all the marks of a temporary structure. Slightly leaning shelves, window frames scarred by transport. Even so, it was one of the quietest places in the POW compound. A week later, on an afternoon of fierce sunlight when the benches under the sunshade were too hot to sit comfortably, Tanaka Ruri stepped inside for the first time. She had sat uneasily for a while, the cotton spool turning between her fingers until the fibers reddened her skin. When the broadcast ended, she rose and walked slowly along the dirt path toward the library. The door stood half open. She paused, as if confirming whether she was actually allowed inside. The clerk at the entrance looked up briefly and nodded, indicating that the reading space was available to her. It was a simple, direct gesture, without emotion and without any implication of special treatment. Inside, the air was cooler, the smell of paper mixed with damp wood forming a muted and steady kind of quiet. A few prisoners sat in the corners, paging through atlases or language primers. Some scribbled notes on scrap paper, others merely stared at the pictures. Ruri did not approach the shelves at once. She moved along the wall as someone accustomed to yielding space. The wooden floor creaked faintly under her feet. Eventually she stopped at the outermost row of shelves, where magazines and picture books with relatively intact pages were kept. She drew out one atlas whose corners were slightly curled. The cover showed a blurred photograph of European mountains. She could not read the title, but could recognize the faded letters. She opened it carefully, her fingertips resting on the paper for a moment. The landscapes, buildings, maps, and captions inside were unlike any propaganda booklet she had ever seen. They did not aim to stir or indoctrinate. They merely presented the fact that these places existed. She stared at the outlines of those mountain ranges for a long time. They were landscapes far from war, parts of a world she had never been allowed to imagine. She did not know precisely what the images represented, but she could tell that they were not meant to command, only to describe. In her memory, there was almost nothing to compare that feeling to. She closed the atlas. Outside, the wind moved the paper panes in the window with a slight flutter. She did not stay long. After replacing the book, she paused again at the doorway, as if waiting for some unformed thought to settle. The evening broadcast began on schedule. The voice from the loudspeaker remained steady and calm. She sat on a bench, listening to words she still could not fully understand, yet whose rhythm she could now recognize. The news spoke of rain in a certain state, of civilian activities somewhere else. These were events that did not target her, that did not attempt to shape her behavior. For the first time, she sensed that the world she was listening to no longer defined her primarily as prisoner, enemy, or subordinate. That night she placed the temperature card at its usual spot on the bed frame. It had become an object she had to confront every day. The numbers lined up more tightly now. Each measurement inscribed her existence on a grid that would not be erased by performance or failure. In the old army, her body had never been recorded in this way. Her work, endless small tasks, constant service, tied her existence to the needs of others. The numbers on the card did not praise or blame her, yet they stated with an impartial steadiness, "You were here today." When she lay down, the camp lights were dimmed to almost invisible gray. The air was motionless, though not oppressive. She heard the rustle of leaves outside and the brief electrical click of the broadcast room shutting down. She closed her eyes. In her chest there was neither the chaos of defeat nor the rigid readiness of the barracks. Instead, there was a state she had no name for. Quiet, but not hollow. Unfamiliar, but not dangerous. This daily life without orders forced her to examine herself in a different way. On the surface, camp life remained uneventful. Morning, roll call, health checks, meals, short periods of free time, lights out at night. Each segment was determined by the clock and by prisoner numbers. At first, Tanaka Ruri was uneasy with this regularity. In the old army, time was to be endured, not arranged. Tasks came from a superior's mood, not from a timetable. This new stability, devoid of personal favor or pressure, gave her no obvious place to stand. Yet it was precisely this cold but predictable order that made her gradually realize there was such a thing as being alive, even when she had no tasks to complete. She began to sit under the sunshade each morning. At first, she still kept to the very end of a bench, maintaining the posture of someone who should not take up space. As days passed, her shoulders gently dropped, and her feet could rest flat on the ground rather than hovering or pulling inward. Around her, other prisoners discussed repatriation, their own uncertain futures, and relatives back home. She understood some of it, but rarely looked up to join in. It was as if she were listening to the everyday talk of ordinary people, and this talk, which had nothing to do with orders, quietly altered her breathing. The loudspeaker still came on at fixed times. She began to pick out repeated words, city names, weather terms, standard greetings. She did not yet know their exact meanings, but she could tell from intonation whether the news was serious, light, or neutral. This act of trying to understand was something almost entirely absent from her previous life, in which most of her time had been spent executing orders, not interpreting information. One day, she heard faint reading from the library. While she was straightening the benches outside, someone inside was reciting English words and searching for similar sounds in Japanese. It was the voice of another prisoner trying to learn a language. The voice was soft, but more directly revealing than the broadcast. Someone was attempting to adapt to this world. She stopped in the doorway, standing there longer than usual, then stepped back into the library. This time she did not hug the wall. She walked a few steps farther in. Light from the window fell on the tables, stretching the shadows of piled books into long bars. She again picked up the atlas and turned to a page showing a station where people stood with luggage on a platform, framed by tracks and billboards. She could not read the captions, but she could sense from the photo alone a rhythm of life not ruled by war. Her hand lingered at the edge of the picture, and for a while, time seemed to stop on that page. In the old army, she had been trained to be a shadow, always on call. Any sign of personal curiosity or interest was branded inattentive or not understanding the larger picture. Here, no one stopped her from reading. No one monitored how long she stayed on a page. The existence of the library itself declared that knowledge and information did not belong exclusively to the powerful, nor were they distributed according to rank. That afternoon, she sat longer than before. The mountains, streets, railroads, and parks in the atlas were presented in a way that did not emphasize use at all. For the first time, she saw human activity rather than military need. At evening roll call, she remained as quiet as ever, but her steps were noticeably steadier. She went to her designated place in the line without constantly checking if she stood too far forward or backward. The American officer checked numbers quickly. When he called hers, she merely nodded, with no extra movement. From that day on, she began to notice small changes in the camp. 2 boards on the sunshade replaced, tools rearranged on a rack, a few new pale-covered magazines on the library shelf. She did not consciously catalogue these details, yet they surfaced in her awareness on their own. In the past, she had only watched for where commands came from. Now she was observing how the environment itself shifted. After dinner, the temperature dropped and some prisoners walked up and down the open yard. She followed the group at a fixed distance. The dirt road was pressed into shallow tracks. The air smelled of trees. She had no one to talk to and did not intend to seek conversation, but her own pace grew even, no longer jerking between hurried and hesitant. The camp had a regular army doctor who called prisoners for checkups each afternoon. When it was her turn, he asked, as usual, whether she felt unwell. She did not catch every word, but she understood he was waiting for an answer. She tapped her knee lightly, then shook her head to show it no longer hurt. He wrote a few notes on the form and did not press or rebuke her. For the first time, she realized that here, other people's attention was neither authority nor threat. It was just part of how the system functioned. Back in the barracks, she set the record card on the plank beside her bed and stared at the growing column of numbers. This was a record that did not depend on good or bad performance. It simply showed that her body, her day, her breathing had occupied time and space. She touched the edge of the card. It felt cooler now in the night air. The cotton spool lay beside it, the 2 objects forming a sharp contrast under the dim light. One belonged to a past of servile labor, the other to a present of steady documentation. That night she quietly understood something was changing. She was no longer trapped entirely in waiting for the next order. She had begun to see that today itself was something she was actually living through. That afternoon, the broadcast content changed temporarily. In addition to the usual weather and community news, there was a longer report. She still could not follow all of it, but the words war, end, and soon appeared again and again. Nearby, a few prisoners who understood English spoke in low tones, sharing brief guesses. There was no cheering and no despair, only a kind of silence that refused to believe too quickly. Ruri sat a little straighter on the bench. Her shoulders tightened slightly, but this time her eyes did not search for a source of orders. She simply watched the loudspeaker. She did not understand the sentences, yet she knew the world was moving toward something, and for the first time, that direction did not depend on her obedience. She had been taught that war was her only home, and loyalty her only worth. But in the broadcast, the war was simply one piece of news among many. A few days later, the camp posted a notice. The library would take on an afternoon volunteer to organize books and register loans. The notice was brief to the point, as emotionally neutral as all other announcements. Ruri, passing by, glanced at it as she always did. Her eyes stopped when they reached the word organize. That was the action most familiar to her. In the past, she had straightened equipment, cleaned supplies, mended clothing. Her entire existence in the army was built on putting things in order. But here, organizing books required no declaration of loyalty, no effort to please a superior. It was simply one position in the system. She stood at the door for several seconds, then stepped inside the library. The volunteer was a middle-aged prisoner with a mild manner. He merely nodded when he saw her and did not ask why she had come. He handed her a dog-eared magazine and indicated where it should be shelved. The action was simple, one she had performed countless times, but this time its meaning was entirely different. In the old army, such an action meant serving. Here, it meant taking part. She put the magazine back on the shelf. No one shouted at her. No one demanded she hurry up, and no one treated her labor as naturally owed. The volunteer wrote 2 lines in a notebook and went on with his own work. It was the first time she had completed a task without orders, threats, or bargains. That afternoon, she helped straighten 3 full shelves. With each reach and each adjustment, she felt more clearly that action itself did not automatically carry humiliation, nor did it drop her back into a structure of exploitation. She was simply doing a piece of work. No one stood above her because of it, and no one beneath her. Before lights out that evening, the loudspeaker played a piece of piano music. The melody was slow. Ruri sat at the edge of her bunk and did not move. She did not know the piece's name or purpose, but she could tell there was no hostility in it. The sounds she had known in the old army were drills, orders, and shouted slogans. This was the first sound she heard that had nothing to do with command. The next morning, during the checkup, the army doctor gestured for her to add the date to her record card. She looked at the pencil. In the old barracks, she had never been asked to write anything that belonged personally to her. Her identity had always been written and defined by others. The doctor tapped the paper lightly, meaning simply, "Your name. Write it yourself." The pencil trembled slightly in her hand, as if she needed to confirm that this act would not bring punishment. She wrote her name. It was the first time in the POW camp that she had used written words to confirm herself. The handwriting was uneven, but beside the numerical columns, it stood out with unexpected clarity. That line of letters revealed a simple truth she had overlooked for years. She was a person who could be recorded as an individual, not just a function in a category. When the checkup ended, she stepped into the sunlight outside and paused. The wind lifted her sleeve. This time, she did not reflexively draw in her movements. She simply stood there and let the air carry the dampness away from her cuffs. She understood, with a cool and practical clarity, that loyalty had once been her only language. But here, it was no longer required for survival. That afternoon, she sat under the sunshade as usual. A young prisoner attempted to converse in halting English with a guard, his pronunciation stiff but earnest. Ruri listened to the unfamiliar words, steady as the broadcast voices. She realized that she could choose to understand or not understand, to try to learn or to remain silent, and whichever she chose, her fate would not change in that instant. The mere fact of being able to choose was a kind of freedom that had never existed in her previous life. At sunset, she walked back along the dirt path to the barracks, her footsteps mixed with the faint noise from the broadcast room. Outside the fence, there was still nothing to see, but the boundary itself no longer looked like a wall. It resembled more a structure she had already started to pass through. On a windy afternoon a few days later, the sunshade's edge was lifted by gusts. Ruri sat beside the bench, holding the old cotton spool. In the past, she would tap its outer layer with her thumb whenever she felt nervous or waited for orders, using the rhythm to steady herself. That day, she did not tap. Instead, she slowly pulled out a length of thread. The cotton loosened, forming a thin white arc. She had no particular purpose, letting the thread slip from the spool of its own weight. It was an action not aimed at obedience, not attached to any task. For the first time, she permitted herself to do something with no practical value. The wind shaped the thread between her fingers. Its end swayed gently. She did not hurry to wind it back, allowing it to draw an irregular curve in the air. The motion was tiny, but for her, it marked a loosening in an old structure. The thread was no longer there to mend uniforms, secure bandages, or maintain her function. It belonged, for a moment, to her alone. From the distance came the faint noise of books being moved. The library volunteer was rearranging the shelves. Ruri wound the thread back around her finger, tucked the spool into her pocket, and walked toward the hut along a strip of light. Inside, the library was quieter than usual. A few newly donated magazines sat on the table, their covers showing city streets and people in far-off places. Beside the shelves lay a worn-out ledger filled with prisoner numbers, loan dates, and return marks. When the volunteer looked up and saw her, he was not surprised. He slid a thick booklet across the table. The pages contained simple pictures with English words in bold beneath them, more basic than the atlas. She opened to the first page, a photograph of a cup. Beneath it, a word in English. She did not yet know how to pronounce it, but she could recognize the letters. The volunteer did not demonstrate the sound. He simply pointed to the phonetic marks above and then to her. No instruction, no insistence, only an offer. She did not speak, only nodded slightly, letting her finger rest on that page a little longer. In the past, language was a realm she could not touch. She could listen to orders, but not understand the wider world behind them. Now, for the first time, she stood before knowledge that did not belong to the military or to command. When she put the booklet down and turned to leave, she noticed an old Japanese book beside the table, left by an earlier prisoner. Its pages were worn at the edges, but intact. In that moment, she understood that others had come here searching for ways to comprehend the world, and that such attempts, within the bounds of this system, did not betray their past. Outside, the air was slightly damp. She walked slowly back to the benches, her steps even. The loudspeaker came on again, mentioning some agreement being negotiated somewhere, the tone neutral and unembellished. Prisoners paused to listen to a voice from a country that was not theirs. Ruri sat down. Her fingers brushed the cotton spool in her pocket. This time she did not take it out. It lay quietly against the fabric, like a symbol she no longer needed to clutch. She realized that in the past, that spool had carried the entire weight of her skills and duties, while now it stood as proof that she could let go of her old identity. At roll call that night, her movements were calmer than before. She no longer forced herself perfectly upright nor deliberately lowered her head. She simply stood in line, was numbered, confirmed, recorded, and then returned to her bunk. After lights out, only breathing remained in the darkened barracks. She unfolded the temperature record card and studied the ranks of numbers. They were neither reward nor punishment, only traces of a life lived day by day. She slid the card under her pillow, not to hide it, but to keep it close through the night. In the past, she had owned nothing that truly belonged to her. Now, these figures were the most direct expression of her identity. Outside, the wind gradually died down. The barbed wire fence stood in silhouette against the night sky. When darkness fully settled, she realized with unusual clarity that something new had taken root inside her. She had begun to feel she had a future, not one bestowed by the nation or by the army or by anyone else. A future that depended on whether she herself chose to keep walking. The news of repatriation arrived on a windless morning. A new notice was tacked to a wooden post, its corners lifting faintly in the breeze. It announced that identity checks would soon begin and that prisoners would be required to confirm their origin, family information, and willingness to return home. Prisoners gathered briefly in front of it. Some were silent. Some showed expressions that defied easy explanation, and others revealed a complicated sense of loosening. The news spread through the camp with the same measured rhythm as the system itself. On her way to the library that afternoon, Ruri passed the notice board. She could not read everything, but she recognized the words return and home, which came up again and again. She stood before the paper, her sleeves stirring in the wind, and remained there longer than most. Going home had once been the unquestionable endpoint of her trajectory in the old army. Nation, unit, family, these words had formed a complete structure that seemed to predecide her entire life's direction. But in the months at the POW camp, she had, for the first time, lived a continuous stretch of time without superiors, orders, or a predefined role. She dimly realized that if she returned, the old structure would close around her again. Her identity would be redefined. Her life would resume a single narrow track. Familiar, yes, but confining. The next afternoon she was summoned for a pre-repatriation medical review. The army doctor followed the form, examining and asking questions in turn. Her temperature card was now nearly full. Every line bore witness to the life she had lived inside the camp. In the final box, the doctor made a mark, indicating that physically she was fit to go home. Leaving the examination hut, she held the card in her hand. The paper, worn by long use, had softened, its corners curling slightly. She smoothed them out with her thumb, but did not tuck it back in its usual place. Outside, the wind caught one edge of the card. She did not press it down. She let it rest in her hand, in a posture that was neither entirely secured nor entirely free. The evening broadcast came on as usual, reporting calmly on the progress of some agreement. She sat on the bench with the cotton spool on her knees. A single thread hung through the crack between the planks. She did not reel it in or wind it tighter, only watched as the air moved it faintly. Around the camp, several prisoners had begun packing. They folded clothes into neat piles, placed their meager belongings into wooden boxes, and set the boxes at the foot of their beds. Some spoke quietly about their journey home. Others bent over their record cards in silence. Ruri sat on her own bunk. There was almost nothing she needed to sort. She owned 2 pieces of worn clothing, a pencil issued during medical checks, and her temperature record card. Late that night, after the lights went out, the air grew still with the falling temperature. She laid the cotton spool on her chest and breathed lightly. Under its weight, she was acutely aware that this was no longer an extension of her old identity, but a marker of where her new one might begin. It had once embodied her duty. Now it was simply one of her possessions. The following morning, the repatriation group assembled in the center of the camp. The road beyond the fence had been swept clean. Fresh tire tracks showed where transport trucks would soon arrive. Ruri walked to the assembly point with her hands at her sides, her pace steady. She felt neither obvious tension nor clear expectation, only a new way of experiencing the air around her. The American officers called numbers from the list. She answered when hers was read. Then she handed her temperature record card to the clerk. The card that contained her entire life as a prisoner was placed in a fat file folder with many other documents. It was the system's final act, to acknowledge her existence in the same manner as everyone else's. The column began to move toward the gate. Many prisoners lifted their heads to look beyond the barbed wire, eyes full of a distinct sense of direction. As Ruri stepped past the edge of the wooden shelter, she slowed for a heartbeat. In that moment, she understood clearly that the quiet she had learned here, the images on the pages, the sound of the broadcasts, and the numbers on her card had grown into a stretch of life that could not be erased, a way of living no longer entirely dependent on others, no longer wholly dictated by orders. She raised her head and walked forward without looking back at the camp. The barbed wire was no longer the boundary that had confined her, the shadow she had already passed through. As she climbed onto the truck, the wind blew in from the sea. She pressed her sleeve down lightly. The cotton spool lay silent in her pocket. It was no longer a symbol of her old duty, nor merely proof of who she once was. It had become the starting point she would carry with her into the post-war world. Wars would end, systems would change, nations would be rebuilt. For the first time, she understood. She was not just a square on someone else's chart, she was a whole person.